People think owning thousands of acres makes you powerful, but the truth is, sometimes the smallest strip of land is worth more than everything around it. The smell of fresh asphalt drifted through my truck window long before I reached the front gate of my ranch, and the low hum of hundreds of tires rolling across brand-new pavement sounded completely wrong against the quiet Texas morning I had known my entire life. I eased my pickup over the last hill, expecting to see open pasture stretching toward the cedar trees my grandfather planted decades ago. Instead, I froze with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. A massive stone entrance stood in the middle of my property like it had always belonged there. Two towering limestone columns supported an iron arch that proudly announced Stone Ridge Estates. Beneath it, freshly landscaped flower beds curved around a divided boulevard leading straight through land my family had owned for more than 70 years. SUVs, delivery vans, school buses, and golf carts streamed through the entrance as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Not one driver had the slightest idea they were crossing private property. The crunch of gravel I remembered had disappeared beneath smooth black pavement that still shimmered from yesterday's paving crews. The scent of hot tar mixed with freshly cut grass, while automatic sprinklers hissed beside decorative oak trees planted exactly where my grandfather used to park his old tractor every fall. I stepped out of the truck, boots sinking into loose dirt beside the new sidewalk, trying to convince myself I was looking at the wrong place. Then I saw the old windmill on the distant ridge. It was mine. Every fence line matched the survey burned into my memory since childhood. Every hill, every creek, every weathered oak belonged to my ranch. Which meant that entrance did too. Before I could take another step, a security golf cart rolled toward me. The guard climbed out wearing a bright polo shirt with the HOA logo stitched across the chest. He smiled politely until he noticed my boots covered in ranch dust. "Residents use the right lane, sir," he said. "Contractors check in at the visitor entrance." I stared at him for a second, wondering if he realized how absurd those words sounded. "This is my property," I answered calmly. He gave me the kind of smile people reserve for someone they assume is confused. "Actually, sir, this entrance belongs to Stone Ridge Estates." At that exact moment, a white luxury SUV glided beneath the stone arch. The driver's window lowered, revealing Victoria Langford, president of the Homeowners Association. Designer sunglasses hid her eyes, but her smile was impossible to miss. "Good morning," she called. "Beautiful entrance, isn't it? It really transformed this old land into something useful." She didn't sound angry. She sounded proud, like she honestly believed she had improved my family's legacy. Then she drove through the gate without another word, disappearing into the neighborhood that had quietly grown across the edge of my ranch, while everyone acted as though ownership had become nothing more than a technicality. I never raised my voice. I never argued with the guard. I simply stood there listening to another line of vehicles disappear down the boulevard, while one sentence my grandfather repeated my entire childhood echoed louder than the traffic itself. "Never sell the corridor, son. One day, everyone will need the peace they laughed at." I could still hear my grandfather's voice as I watched another stream of luxury vehicles disappear beneath those stone columns. He never wasted words, and when he did speak about the ranch, every sentence sounded more like a lesson than a conversation. He bought the first 600 acres in 1954 after returning from the Korean War with little more than determination and a pickup truck that barely ran. Over the next 40 years, he slowly expanded the property one neighboring parcel at a time until our family owned just over 2,300 acres of rolling pasture, cedar groves, limestone ridges, and a narrow valley that connected the county highway to everything beyond it. Most people admired the sweeping hills or the spring-fed creek that crossed the eastern pasture, but my grandfather always cared about something else entirely. There was a long strip of land, only a few dozen feet wide in places, that stretched from the highway through the valley like a ribbon. To everyone else, it looked insignificant. It was too narrow for grazing and too uneven for building. More than once I asked him why he never sold it to neighboring developers who kept offering generous checks. He would simply smile beneath the brim of his weathered hat and say, "Land is not valuable because of how much you own. It is valuable because of what cannot happen without it." Back then I thought he was just being stubborn. Like most teenagers, I assumed older people refused to change because they enjoyed saying no. After he passed away, the ranch became my responsibility. I stayed because this place was more than an investment. Every fence post carried memories of weekends repairing storm damage beside him. Every oak tree reminded me of summer evenings listening to coyotes while he explained that patience solved more problems than anger ever could. I modernized the cattle operation, leased portions for hay production, and invested carefully enough that I never needed to carve the property into housing developments like so many neighboring ranches had done. One by one, those ranches disappeared beneath rooftops, sidewalks, and identical mailboxes. Then Stone Ridge Estates arrived. At first it seemed harmless enough. A few survey crews, then construction trailers, then concrete trucks that rolled past my fence from sunrise until dusk. I never objected because every map I reviewed showed the subdivision ending at the property line. Their engineers waved politely whenever we crossed paths, and I assumed professionals understood where boundaries existed. Looking back now, I realized that assumption was my first mistake. Somewhere along the way, someone decided that asking permission was less convenient than pretending permission already existed. As I stood beside that brand new entrance, another school bus rolled through the gate, while children laughed inside without the slightest clue they were crossing land that had belonged to one family for generations. None of those families were my enemies. Most of them probably believed every inch of pavement had been built legally. The only person who smiled with complete confidence was Victoria Langford, because she believed ownership was whatever people accepted long enough. She had no idea that my grandfather had spent decades protecting one overlooked corridor that almost everyone considered worthless. Standing there with the warm smell of asphalt mixing with cedar carried by the morning breeze, I finally understood exactly why he never sold that forgotten strip of land, and for the first time in my life, his quiet warning no longer sounded mysterious. It sounded like the beginning of a plan. Over the next several days, I stopped reacting and started watching. There is a huge difference between the two. Every morning before sunrise, I parked my truck on the same ridge where my grandfather used to drink his coffee, and from there I could see the entire entrance unfolding like a carefully rehearsed performance. Landscaping crews trimmed hedges with military precision. Maintenance workers polished the stone signs until they reflected the morning light. Sprinklers hissed across fresh sod while flags snapped gently in the breeze. Everything looked perfect, and that perfection was exactly what Victoria Langford wanted the world to see. She treated Stone Ridge Estates less like a neighborhood and more like a personal brand. Every mailbox matched. Every flower bed followed the same color pattern. Even the benches near the entrance carried bronze plaques thanking the Homeowners Association for its vision and leadership. It would have impressed almost anyone driving through for the first time. What they could not see was how carefully that image had been built on assumptions instead of permission. Victoria seemed to believe confidence could replace ownership if she displayed enough of it. A week after I returned, I attended one of the monthly county planning meetings. I sat quietly in the back while developers, engineers, and homeowners discussed future projects. When Victoria entered the room, conversation stopped for a moment as people greeted her by name. She carried herself with the polished confidence of someone who had spent years convincing others that she always had the correct answer. During the meeting, she proudly presented photographs of the new entrance and thanked several contractors for completing what she called an important community improvement. She never once mentioned my ranch. She never acknowledged private property. She spoke as though the entire project had naturally appeared because progress demanded it. Several people applauded. I simply listened. After the meeting, she finally noticed me standing near the hallway windows. Her smile never faded. "Mr. Walker," she said warmly, extending her hand as though we were old friends. "I hope you are enjoying the improvements. They really increased property values for everyone nearby." I looked at her for a moment before answering. "Including mine?" She laughed softly, almost as if I had made a harmless joke. "Sometimes we all have to make small sacrifices for the greater good." That sentence stayed with me all the way back to the ranch. Small sacrifices. She was talking about generations of family ownership as though it were an inconvenience that could simply be absorbed into her master plan. Over the following days, I noticed something else. Delivery trucks, utility contractors, emergency vehicles, moving companies, school buses, and every resident entering Stone Ridge Estates used exactly the same entrance. There was no secondary road, no alternate gate, no hidden connection to another highway. Every single vehicle passed through the narrow corridor my grandfather had refused to sell. It happened so naturally that nobody seemed to question it anymore. The more I watched, the clearer the picture became. Stone Ridge Estates looked enormous from the inside, but its entire future rested on one forgotten strip of land that everyone had stopped noticing because it worked so well. Victoria believed she had created independence. In reality, she had built complete dependence without ever realizing it. Victoria did not stop with the entrance. Success seemed to convince her that every new addition automatically became legitimate if enough people used it. Within 2 weeks, decorative lighting lined both sides of the boulevard. Brick monument signs appeared beside the highway. Landscapers planted rows of live oaks that reached several feet onto my side of the original survey markers. One afternoon, I watched contractors install a polished bronze directory listing every street inside Stone Ridge Estates. Families slowed their cars to admire it. Realtors parked nearby with clients and proudly described the neighborhood as one of the fastest-growing communities in the county. Nobody questioned why every improvement rested on land that had never been sold. What surprised me most was how quickly assumptions became accepted facts. Local delivery drivers updated their navigation systems. Utility companies marked the entrance as community infrastructure. Even online maps began showing the boulevard as the official access road. Reality was slowly being replaced by repetition. The more often people drove across my property, the more certain they became that it belonged to someone else. A few days later, I found a neatly folded envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my truck while it sat beside my own fence line. The paper carried the Stone Ridge Estates logo embossed across the top. Inside was a courteous letter thanking me for supporting the neighborhood and informing me that unauthorized parking near the entrance created an unpleasant appearance for prospective homebuyers. The letter politely requested that I avoid leaving work vehicles within sight of the community gateway. I actually laughed out loud. My pickup was parked on my own ranch. The smell of fresh cedar drifting across the pasture mixed with the faint scent of printer ink as I read the letter twice, just to make sure I had not misunderstood it. Later that afternoon, I drove to the association office, a newly built brick building overlooking the subdivision clubhouse. Victoria welcomed me with the same calm smile she always wore. Her office walls displayed framed awards, community photographs, and architectural renderings of future expansion phases. She spoke confidently about beautification, long-term planning, and shared prosperity. Then she slid a color site plan across the desk. My narrow corridor was shaded. The same color as every HOA common area. It simply functions better this way, she explained. People already think of it as part of the community. We should focus on practical solutions instead of outdated boundaries. I looked down at the drawing without touching it. The corridor my grandfather had protected for decades had been reduced to a colored strip on a presentation board. Did anyone ever ask to buy it? I asked quietly. She folded her hands together and smiled again. Sometimes progress moves faster than paperwork. There was not a trace of guilt in her voice. She genuinely believed convenience carried more weight than ownership. As I walked back outside, a gentle breeze carried the sound of children playing near the neighborhood park and the distant rumble of another moving truck entering through the gate. Stone Ridge Estates continued growing larger every day, adding more families, more homes, more expectations, and with every new arrival the neighborhood placed even greater trust in one overlooked piece of land that no one had legally secured. Standing beside my truck, I realized Victoria had built far more than an impressive entrance. She had built an entire community upon the assumption that the one person who actually owned the ground beneath it would eventually give up. For a brief moment, I considered hiring the biggest law firm in the state and filing a lawsuit the next morning. Anger makes simple plans sound brilliant. Fortunately, my grandfather had taught me to let frustration cool before making expensive decisions. Instead of marching into court, I spent the next week speaking with surveyors, title specialists, and 2 real estate attorneys who had spent decades dealing with rural property disputes. Their answers were not what I wanted to hear. The first attorney leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and sighed before explaining that even when ownership appeared obvious, litigation involving developed property could take years. Hundreds of homeowners now depended on that entrance. Developers, contractors, lenders, and insurance companies would all become involved. Every motion would generate another response. Every hearing could be delayed. He estimated legal fees alone could climb well into six figures before anyone reached a final decision. The second attorney studied aerial photographs of my ranch, tapped the entrance road with his pen, and gave me almost the same warning. He believed my position looked strong, but he also believed the association would fight relentlessly because too much money depended on that roadway remaining exactly where it was. Walking back to my truck after that meeting, I could taste dusty West Texas air carried across the parking lot by a steady afternoon wind. For the first time since returning home, I felt genuinely trapped. I owned the land beneath the entrance, yet everyone else behaved as though I was merely an obstacle standing in the way of progress. County officials remained polite but cautious whenever I called. Nobody wanted to choose sides while attorneys argued over surveys and deeds. Meanwhile, Stone Ridge Estates continued expanding. New foundations appeared every week. Concrete mixers rolled through the entrance before sunrise. Realtors placed colorful signs along the boulevard advertising the final phase of luxury homes. The neighborhood acted as though tomorrow was guaranteed. Victoria certainly did. One Saturday morning, I watched her greeting prospective buyers beneath the stone arch with coffee and pastries while a string quartet played during an open house event. She spoke confidently about the community's future, the convenient location, and the beautifully designed entrance that welcomed every resident home. Standing on the ridge above them, I realized something important. She was investing even more money into a place she did not actually control. Every decorative light, every landscaped median, every banner celebrating another sold home increased the neighborhood's dependence on that single corridor. Most people would have viewed that as my problem. I began wondering whether it might eventually become hers instead. Even so, I still lacked the one thing I needed most. I did not need a louder argument. I did not need a more aggressive attorney. I needed to understand why my grandfather had protected that forgotten strip of land with such determination. Men like him never made decisions based on emotion. They made them because they saw consequences years before everyone else noticed them. That evening, I unlocked the old ranch office, a weathered building that still smelled faintly of leather, cedar, and machine oil. Dust floated through the fading sunlight as I looked toward the shelves where decades of maps, closing documents, handwritten notes, and survey records had remained untouched since the day he passed away. Somewhere inside that quiet room, I became convinced, was the reason he had smiled every time someone offered to buy the corridor that everyone else believed was worthless. The old ranch office had not changed in decades. Every drawer still stuck halfway open. Every filing cabinet carried faded labels written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. The room smelled of aged paper, cedar boards, and the faint trace of motor oil that seemed permanently woven into the building itself. I switched on a dusty desk lamp and began opening boxes one at a time. Closing statements, livestock records, grazing leases, tax receipts, hand-drawn maps, and yellowed survey plats slowly covered the desk until there was barely enough room to set down a coffee mug. Midnight came and went without me noticing. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof while I compared document after document, searching for the one detail everyone else had overlooked. Near the bottom of a cabinet marked corridor files, I found a weathered leather binder held together by a brittle strap. Inside were handwritten notes dating back more than 40 years. My grandfather had documented every conversation involving that narrow strip of land. Developers had offered to buy it. Utility companies had requested easements. Investors had proposed land swaps. Every offer carried the same handwritten response in the margin. Declined. Preserve continuous ownership. Tucked behind those notes was a folded county survey that looked older than I was. The paper crackled as I carefully unfolded it across the desk. Unlike the colorful digital maps everyone used today, this survey showed every boundary, every monument marker, and every recorded access point with remarkable precision. My eyes stopped on one sentence typed beside the corridor. Exclusive fee ownership retained by grantor. No permanent public dedication recorded. I read it again, then a third time. The corridor had never been dedicated as a public road. It had never been transferred to the county. It had never become common property. Ownership had remained exactly where it had always been, with my family. That explained why my grandfather guarded it so carefully. But another document changed everything. Clipped behind the survey was a letter from a land planner written decades earlier. The planner warned that future regional development would likely depend on that exact corridor because the surrounding limestone bluffs and protected creek crossings severely limited alternative access. In plain English, there would eventually be only one practical entrance for any major subdivision built beyond our ranch. My grandfather had underlined one sentence in blue ink. Whoever controls this corridor controls the future access to every parcel beyond it. I leaned back in the old wooden chair and listened to the rain striking the roof while that realization settled in. Victoria had never stolen the most valuable part of my ranch. She had unknowingly concentrated the value into a single overlooked ribbon of land by building an entire neighborhood around it. Every decorative improvement, every additional home, every new resident had increased the importance of the one asset she did not own. Suddenly, all of her confidence made perfect sense. She believed usage had replaced ownership because nobody had challenged the assumption. I carefully returned every document to the binder, closed the worn leather cover, and smiled for the first time since driving beneath those stone columns. I finally understood what my grandfather had spent a lifetime protecting. The corridor was never meant to make us rich by selling it. It was meant to remain valuable because one day someone else would build a future that could not function without it. Once I understood what the corridor truly represented, my entire strategy changed. I stopped thinking like a frustrated landowner and started thinking like my grandfather. He never rushed into battles he could win by waiting. The next morning I drove into town carrying nothing except the leather binder, a notebook, and a calm expression. I did not visit another litigation attorney. Instead, I met with a commercial real estate broker who specialized in large ranch transactions and access easements. His office overlooked the county courthouse, and through the window, I could see people hurrying between title companies, banks, and law offices. The smell of fresh coffee filled the conference room as I spread the old survey across the table. He studied the documents for nearly 20 minutes without speaking. Finally, he looked up and asked a question that confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. "You are not interested in selling the whole ranch, are you?" I smiled for the first time that morning. Not even close. Then I pointed to the narrow corridor running from the highway through the valley. "I only want to know what this piece is worth to the right buyer." He leaned back in his chair and quietly shook his head. "On paper, not much acreage. In practice, it controls access. Those are two very different things." Over the next several weeks, he contacted a handful of experienced land investors without revealing my identity. I instructed him to avoid developers connected to Stone Ridge Estates or anyone likely to alert Victoria. I wanted the process to remain completely ordinary, completely legal, and completely invisible. Meanwhile, I continued living exactly as I always had. I repaired fences, checked water tanks, and moved cattle between pastures. Every morning, I watched another line of vehicles glide beneath the stone entrance, while Victoria continued celebrating the success of her expanding neighborhood. New banners advertised additional homes coming soon. Landscaping crews planted another row of trees beside the boulevard. Decorative lights illuminated the entrance every evening like a luxury resort welcoming guests. She was investing more money into improvements she assumed would remain under her control forever. Several neighbors stopped by my ranch during those weeks and asked whether I planned to sue the homeowners association. I simply shrugged and told them I was reviewing my options. That answer spread surprisingly fast. Before long, people seemed convinced I had accepted the situation. Even Victoria appeared more relaxed whenever we crossed paths at county meetings. She greeted me politely, spoke about future growth, and acted as though the disagreement had quietly faded away. I never corrected her. Silence can be remarkably persuasive when someone already believes they have won. Then, late one Friday afternoon, my broker called while I was repairing a section of fence along the north pasture. The sun was dropping behind the hills, turning the limestone cliffs golden as a warm breeze carried the scent of fresh hay across the valley. His voice remained calm, almost casual. "We found someone," he said. "An investor with substantial experience managing strategic access properties. He understands exactly what the corridor is worth, and he is prepared to make a serious offer." I looked toward the distant entrance where another stream of vehicles disappeared beneath the stone arch. Victoria still believed she owned the future because she could see the road. She never imagined the real decision was about to happen several miles away inside a conference room where her name had not even been mentioned. The closing took less than an hour. After months of watching assumptions grow into concrete, signatures on a handful of legal documents quietly changed the future of Stone Ridge Estates without a single raised voice. The buyer was a seasoned land investor named Charles Bennett, a man with a reputation for purchasing strategically located properties and managing them exactly according to the law. He asked careful questions, reviewed every survey, confirmed every boundary with an independent title company, and completed the purchase without requesting a single special favor. By the time we shook hands, the corridor no longer belonged to my family. It belonged to someone who understood its value and intended to exercise every legal right that came with ownership. I drove back to the ranch beneath a wide Texas sky, feeling strangely peaceful. There was no celebration, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing every document had been signed correctly. 3 mornings later, I heard an unfamiliar sound drifting across the pasture before sunrise. Diesel engines idled near the entrance while survey crews unloaded equipment beside the stone columns. New property markers appeared along the edge of the boulevard, followed by temporary fencing and professionally printed notices explaining that the land had changed ownership and that access policies would be updated by the new owner. Everything looked organized, courteous, and entirely lawful. Around mid-morning, I noticed traffic slowing for the first time since I had returned home. Residents rolled down their windows, reading the posted notices with puzzled expressions. Delivery drivers stopped to make phone calls. Real estate agents stood beside their vehicles pointing toward maps they clearly had not seen before. Shortly afterward, Victoria's white sport utility vehicle arrived much faster than usual. She stepped out carrying a folder thick with papers and walked directly toward Charles, who greeted her with the calm professionalism of someone conducting ordinary business. I could not hear every word from where I stood on the ridge, but I watched the conversation unfold through a pair of binoculars my grandfather used to keep in the ranch office. Victoria pointed repeatedly toward the neighborhood. Charles simply opened a folder, showed her certified copies of the recorded transfer, and gestured politely toward the survey stakes identifying the boundaries. The confidence that had always defined her posture slowly disappeared. By early afternoon, another contractor arrived and began installing a secure access gate farther inside the corridor on the new owner's property. It was not placed out of anger or spite. It reflected the access policy Charles had chosen for his investment. Without an agreement granting unrestricted use, no one could simply assume permanent passage across privately owned land. The practical consequences became obvious almost immediately. Prospective homebuyers canceled appointments after discovering access questions remained unresolved. Moving companies delayed scheduled deliveries. Utility contractors contacted the Homeowners Association requesting clarification before beginning additional work. Conversations that had once focused on landscaping and property values suddenly centered on recorded deeds, easements, and ownership. Standing beside the old windmill, I watched the morning sunlight reflect from the same stone entrance that had once seemed untouchable. It looked exactly as it had the week before. Yet everything had changed because one overlooked corridor had finally been treated the way the law had always treated it. My grandfather had been right all along. The smallest piece of land was never the least important. It was simply waiting for the day everyone else realized why it mattered. Over the following months, the story spread across the county, although not in the dramatic way people usually expect. There were no shouting matches in parking lots, no spectacular courtroom speeches, and no overnight miracles. Instead, there were meetings, negotiations, engineers studying alternate routes, attorneys reviewing recorded deeds that should have been examined before the first shovel ever touched the ground. Reality has a quiet way of catching up with assumptions. Stone Ridge Estates eventually had to confront the same truth my grandfather understood decades earlier. A neighborhood can build beautiful homes, elegant entrances, and impressive landscaping, but none of those things replace legal ownership. I never celebrated anyone else's inconvenience because the families living there had not created the problem. Most of them bought homes believing everything had been planned properly. Several residents eventually visited the ranch to ask what had really happened. I invited them onto the porch, poured fresh coffee, and showed them copies of the original surveys and county records. One by one, they realized the dispute had never been about refusing to cooperate. It had been about respecting property before building on it. Many of them admitted they had only heard one version of the story until they saw the documents for themselves. Victoria resigned from the Homeowners Association several months later. I did not attend the meeting where it happened, and I never spoke publicly about her afterward. By then it no longer mattered. Leadership built on confidence alone rarely survives contact with recorded facts. The stone entrance still stands today, although it looks different every time I drive past it. I no longer see expensive landscaping or polished limestone columns. I see a reminder that every shortcut eventually reaches the same destination. The old windmill still turns above the ranch whenever the Texas wind picks up. The cattle still drift across the pastures in the evening. The cedar trees my grandfather planted continue casting long shadows across the hills just before sunset. Some things deserve to remain exactly as they are. Every now and then I unlock the ranch office and open that worn leather binder again. The pages smell the same. The blue ink has faded slightly, but the words remain perfectly clear. Preserve continuous ownership. I understand them differently now than I did as a child. My grandfather was never protecting a strip of dirt. He was protecting choices. Once you surrender ownership, someone else begins making decisions that belong to you. Looking back, the most valuable lesson had nothing to do with land values or legal strategy. Patience accomplished what anger never could. Careful records defeated assumptions. Quiet preparation accomplished what loud arguments could not. I did not need to outshout anyone. I only needed to understand what I owned and allow the law to recognize what had always been true. Sometimes people ask whether I regret selling that corridor. I simply smile and look toward the valley where everything began. My grandfather once told me that land does not reward the loudest voice. It rewards the person who understands it best. After everything that happened, I finally know exactly what he meant. Justice never arrived with sirens or applause. It arrived one signature at a time. And by the time everyone else understood the importance of that forgotten ribbon of land, the decision had already been made exactly the way my grandfather would have wanted.